Hey, everybody. Glad to have you here. Um, Hope y'all are signing in to join me in reading 13 hours. I know we don't have a lot to do here with quarantine, so I thought maybe this might be a little bit of entertainment. Um, might be a little difficult for me. I haven't read the whole book since probably when I first read the manuscript when we first wrote it. So bear with me. But I also want to thank you all for joining me, joining Shadow Warriors Project, and doing this. If, like I said, I think earlier in my announcement that each week we're going to try to read at least one, maybe two chapters. We'll see how it goes on time. But the first, and I'm being a little too optimistic, but the first 1,000 people that will um, log into Shadow Warriors Project, donate $20 on a reoccurring for the year. We'll get a free autographed signed book by myself. And so I'm really hoping to do that. If you feel inclined to um, donate anything, we greatly appreciate it. If not, totally understand that. We're going to start out with the book and we're going to go from pretty much cover to cover. I think we'll start out with the note to the reader. Um, and I don't want to have too many laughs at the glasses. The older I've gotten in the last 7 years, what I've noticed is my arms have gotten a little shorter. So I got to have a little help reading stuff. But so starting off, here, this book, thanks to Mitch Zukoff and the rest of the Annex security team, Tonto, DB, Jack, um, all of the guys, Tig, for everything that they did to put this book together. God bless them, and also a little recognition to Ty and Glenn, who unfortunately are serving with us up in heaven and can't be here tonight, but they're here with us in spirit. This book documents the last hours of an American diplomatic outpost in one of the most dangerous corners of the globe. Based on exclusive first-hand accounts, it describes the bloody assault, tragic losses, and heroic deeds of the U.S. State Department Special Mission Compound and at a nearby CIA base called the Annex in Benghazi, Libya, from the night of September 11th, 2012, into the morning of the next day. It's not about the officials in the United States government, what they knew, said, or did after the attack, or about the ongoing controversy over talking points, electoral politics, and alleged conspiracies and cover ups. It's not about what happened in hearing rooms of the Capitol, ante rooms of the White House, meeting rooms of the State Department, or green rooms of talk shows. It's about what happened on the ground, in the streets, and on the rooftops of Benghazi when bullets flew. Buildings burned and mortars rained down. When lives were saved, lost, and changed forever. The men whose experiences compromised the soul and spine of this book are well aware of the political storm surrounding Benghazi. They recognize that the word itself has become unmoored, no longer simply the name of a dusty Mediterranean port city in Libya's northeastern coast. They know that some Americans use Benghazi as shorthand for U.S. government malfeasance, or worse. They also understand that their explanations and revelations will be used as evidence to fit arguments and accusations in which they have chosen not to participate. It's not that they are it's not that they don't care about those issues. It's just their purpose. Their intent is to record for history as accurately as possible what they did, what we saw, and what happened to us. And to our friends, our colleagues, and our compatriots during the Battle of Benghazi. Although this is written as a narrative, this is a work of nonfiction. No scenes or chronologies were altered, no dramatic license was taken, and no characters were invented, nor created from composites. Descriptions before, during, and immediately after the battle came from the men that I served with and myself who were there, from verified accounts or both. All dialogue was spoken or heard firsthand by primary sources. Those ascribed to individuals came directly from those individuals. The main sources of this book are the 5 surviving American Security Force contractors, known as operators, who responded to the surprise attack on the Benghazi diplomatic compound, spearheaded the counterattack, and carried out the rescue of State Department personnel and residents of the CIA annex. Several names have been changed or withheld for privacy or security reasons, but all descriptions and information included about individuals are true. Classified details were omitted in keeping with standard non-disclosure agreements among clandestine government employees and contractors. Those changes and omissions had no material effect on the story and did not misrepresent the known facts. The individual accounts of the operators were fundamentally in sync, but occasionally diverged on details, such as when a particular radio call was sent. Whenever possible, the narrative reflects the varying perspectives, but can be attributed to the fast-moving nature of events, the fog of war, the team members overriding concerns about remaining alive rather than keeping track of chronologies. Excuse me. Secondary sources include additional interviews, photos, and videos, the voluminous record of public documents, congressional reports and testimony, and media reports. Those sources, credited where appropriate in the text and cited in the select bibliography, were used to provide context, fill gaps during periods where the primary sources weren't present, and to confirm or elaborate upon the participants' recollections. Further discussion of sourcing can be found at the end of the book in a note on sources, page 305. Previous accounts of these events in books, magazines, and other media have distributed and even have disturbed and even disgusted men whose story is told here. Versions with fictionalized dialogue, imaginary incidents, false or exaggerated claims, and sensationalized allegations serve no purpose other than to inflame or obfuscate. The goal of the real security team members is to recount the Battle of Benghazi through as transparent a lens as possible. They and the family of the 6th operator have a financial stake in this book, but their only editorial demand was that the story be told truthfully. It would be folly to think that this or any other account would be the last word on events with such wide-ranging implications. But after so many words have already flowed, with many more to come, consider it the first word directly from the battlefield, from those who knew from hard experience and seared memories what actually happened during those harrowing 13 hours. Mitchell Zukoff wrote that, and I got to thank him very much. He put it into the words that probably I couldn't have myself. But it's the truth. The only thing that we wanted was to make sure that the truth be told and to be memorialized for history and for those patriots, those Americans, to know what truly happened in the Battle of Benghazi. Next, we move on to the cast of characters. Now, this can be a little entertaining, I suppose. We have first the Annex Security Team with Dave Benton, or also called DB. He was a 38-year former Marine Sergeant and SWAT team officer. DB was a scout sniper whose specialties included hostage rescue, direct action assaults, surveillance, reconnaissance, and close orders battle. Before Benghazi, he'd been honored for contract work in security work in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Taciturn and thoughtful, a married father of 3, DB frequently partnered in Benghazi with his good friend, Chris Tonto Pronto. Next is myself, Mark Geist. At 46 years old, I was the oldest team member of the team. As they say, I was kind of laid back. I spent a dozen years in the Marine Corps, including work in an intelligence unit. Then I became police chief in Colorado, near where I grew up. After running a private investigation company in 2004, I became a security contractor with the State Department in Iraq. I was twice married. I have a son with my first wife and a teenage stepdaughter and an infant daughter with my second wife. Next, we have the infamous Chris Tonto Peranto, a former member of the Army's 75th Ranger Regiment. A voluble Tonto had a personality as colorful as the many tattoos on his muscular body. Okay, I had to read that. I couldn't change it, okay? It's got to be true. At 41, he'd spent a decade working as a contract security operator, a job he considered part of a battle between good and evil in countries throughout the Middle East. Tonto held a master's degree in criminal justice. He owned an insurance adjusting business and had a son and daughter with his second wife. Jack Silva, a former Navy SEAL, Jack spent a decade in the service, carrying out missions in Kosovo and the Middle East. Introspective and smart, Jack left the SEALs to spend more time with his two young sons and his wife, who learned while Jack was in Benghazi that she was pregnant with their third child. At 38, Jack divided time between contract security work and real estate, buying, renovating, and selling properties. Jack often partnered with fellow former Navy SEAL Tyrone Woods. Next, we have John Tigan. Sorry about that. John Tig Tigan. Got it backwards there. Tig was 36 at the time, a former Marine sergeant, also from Colorado, who spent several years as a security contractor for Blackwater. He worked for the company in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq before going to work for the CIA's Global Response Staff. Quiet and precise, the married father of infant twins, Tig was in the midst of his third trip to Benghazi for GRS, making him the team member with the most experience in the city. He often teamed with myself, Mark Geist. And last, we have Tyrone Woods. Tyrone was 41, a powerfully built former Navy SEAL who spent 2 decades in service before returning to civilian life in 2010. During his years as a SEAL, Tyrone had served in Somalia, Afghanistan, and Iraq, where he had earned a Bronze Star with V for valor. Twice married, the father of 3 sons, Tyrone was a nurse and a paramedic. Eager to spend more time with his family, Tyrone had decided that Benghazi would be his last trip with GRS. Some of the other key participants we're going to talk about tonight in the book are J. Christopher Stevens. He was an American ambassador to Libya with a youthful 52. He never married, California-born career Foreign Service officer who dedicated himself to improving relations between the United States and Arab countries. Sean Smith. Sean Smith was a State Department communications officer by day and a well-known online gamer by night. 34 years old, married with 2 young children, Smith worked for the State Department for 10 years after serving in the United States Air Force. Glenn Bub Doherty, a former Navy SEAL, the affable Bub was a member of the Tripoli-based GRS team that flew to Benghazi after the attack began. 42, divorced with no children, Bub had a charismatic blend of discipline and bombhomfy. He was old friends with Roan and Jack from the teams, and newer friends with Tonto from work together in Tripoli. Bob was a CIA staffer. He was the agency's top officer in Benghazi. He oversaw all intelligence activities and personnel at the annex, including the security operators. Next, we have Henry, a civilian in his 60s. Henry worked as a translator at the annex and accompanied the security team on its rescue mission to the diplomatic compound. We also have Alec Henderson, the highest-ranking State Department diplomatic security agent in Benghazi. Henderson was inside the Tactical Operations Center when the attack began. He sounded the first alarm and called the annex and the Tripoli embassy for help. The last 2, we have Dave Ubben. Ubin was a Benghazi-based diplomatic security agent who spent time in the U.S. Army. When the attack began, Ubin and two Tripoli-based DS agents who traveled to Benghazi with Ambassador Stevens ran to their quarters to collect their rifles and body armor. Scott Wicklund was a Benghazi-based diplomatic security agent assigned to protect Ambassador Stevens. A former rescue swimmer in the U.S. Navy, Wicklund led Stevens and computer expert Sean Smith into the villa safe haven where the attack began. Prologue. The bloodthirsty mob bore down on the United States' poorly defended diplomatic post in Benghazi, Libya. Besieged American envoys and staffers withdrew to a locked room as fires set by the attackers drew closer. The Americans prayed and appealed for rescue, calling home to Washington and to nearby allies. If no help came, they feared one of three fates. They'd be killed by the invaders, suffocated from smoke, or be roasted alive. In the meantime, they'd fight. The date was June 5th, 1967. War had just begun between Israel and Egypt, and morning radio reports in Benghazi were filled with false claims that U.S. military planes had provided air cover for Israeli attacks or had bombed Cairo. Less than 700 miles away, hundreds of Benghazians swarmed into the streets and rallied at the consulate of the United Arab Republic, as Egypt was then called. The demonstrators' ranks swelled, with some of the 2,000 Egyptian construction workers then in Libya to build an Olympic-style stadium. Soon they turned violent. The throng grabbed cobblestones from the torn-up streets and headed toward a former Italian bank building that housed the American consulate. A handful of Libyan guards fled their posts. The attackers barraged the buildings with stones and broke through the barred windows and the heavy front door. As the horde approached, the 8 American men and 2 women inside the building frantically burned sensitive documents. The consulate workers were well armed, but the officer in charge, John Corman, recounted in a memoir that he ordered that no one shoot, lest they enrage the mob further. The Americans tossed tear gas grenades to slow the onslaught. Cornered, they met their enemies with rifle butts and axe handles, then retreated up a wide marble staircase. They took refuge in a second-floor vault used as the consulate's communications hub. Unable to reach their quarry, but unwilling to leave, the attackers pillaged the building and set it aflame. Corman feared that the invaders would splash gasoline under the vault door to burn or suffocate the Americans. He kept that thought to himself as fire engulfed the consulate. One consolation for Corman and his colleagues was that the intense heat and thick smoke drove back the mob. The Americans shared 5 gas masks as they destroyed top-secret files and disabled cryptographic machines. Several climbed up onto the roof to continue burning documents, but returned inside when a group of men dropped a ladder down from an adjoining roof and rushed toward them. Unable to reach the consulate workers, the attackers cut the halyard that hoisted the American flag on a rooftop pole, allowing it to hang limp down the front of the building. A U.S. Army captain asked Corman's permission to re-raise the flag. Corman refused, but later he relented. I had been a combat paratrooper in World War II, he wrote. I knew what defiance and a bit of bravura could do for soldiers under mortal stress. A display of courage can be infectious and inspiring, just as an act of cowardice can be demoralizing. Rocks hurled from below, the captain dashed onto the roof and restored the Stars and Stripes to its rightful place. State Department officials in Washington discussed rescue operations, including sending a Marine unit and using paratroopers. But executing those plans would take more time than the Americans had. Meanwhile, the trapped Americans got sporadic phone calls through to their British counterparts, who had a battalion stationed outside Benghazi under a treaty agreement. Four attempts to reach the Americans by 50 British soldiers were repulsed or delayed, and the mob set fire to a British armored car. With no rescue in sight, Corman took down from the wall a photo of President Lyndon Johnson and his wife, Lady Bird Johnson. He broke it from its frame, flipped it over, and wrote on the back that whatever happened, they had done their duty. Everyone in the smoky vault signed the farewell note. As night approached, a garbled message gave State Department officials the misimpression that the Americans were near death. Secretary of State Dan Roos appealed to British. 2 hours later, a British column made another attempt. This time, the British broke through to the consulate and brought all 10 Americans to safety. 45 years later, on September 11, 2012, the American diplomatic outpost in Benghazi again came under attack, under sudden siege by a murderous mob. Again, the attackers couldn't reach their prey, so they plundered buildings and set fires with deadly intent. But this time, no British or other friendly troops were close enough to attempt a rescue. With fires raging, gunmen swarming, State Department security officers taking cover, and the U.S. ambassador missing, a call went out from one of the overwhelmed Americans. If you don't get here soon, you're all going to die. Heeding that call was a band of elite warriors who'd left the United States military and joined a clandestine organization that protected American covert intelligence operatives abroad. They had come to Benghazi as security officers for American diplomats and CIA agents. But now they'd need to rely on their past training. 2 as Navy SEALs, 1 as an Army Ranger, and 3 as Marines. They knew they'd be vastly outnumbered, but they also knew they were their fellow Americans' only hope. And this is their story. Jack Silva leaned forward in his window seat aboard a Turkish Airlines jet as it approached Benghazi's benign airport. He looked outside the plane. He looked outside the plane's shadow racing across the caramel-colored desert below. Jack believed deeply in yin and yang, the Chinese concept that a connection exists between seemingly opposing forces, like dark and light. So it was unsurprising that 2 conflicting thoughts entered his mind. First was excitement. I wonder what adventures this place is going to bring. Then came its counterbalance, worry. I wonder if I'll ever see my family again. It was August 2012, and Jack was about to join the Benghazi team as a secretive U.S. government organization called the Global Response Staff. Created after the 9/11 attacks, GRS consisted of full-time security staffers supplemented by former military special operators like Jack, who were hired on a lucrative contract basis. GRS officers served as bodyguards for spies, diplomats, and other American personnel in the field. The more dangerous the posting, the more likely GRS operators were nearby in the shadows, protecting Americans' envoys and covert intelligence gatherers. Few, if any, postings were more dangerous than Benghazi, Libya. As a former Navy SEAL, Jack was a natural fit for the GRS. At 38 years old, self-possessed and darkly handsome, he stood 6'2" and carried 210 pounds on his muscular frame. In his usual attire of a black t-shirt and khaki shorts, Jack looked like a strapping construction worker. On the plane, though, wearing dark slacks, brown leather shoes, and a tucked-in button-down shirt, he might be mistaken for a American businessman seeking import-export opportunities 10 months after the death of deposed dictator Muammar al-Gaddafi. At least that was Jack's hope as the jet's wheels touched down. Jack's arrival marked his first visit to Libya and the start of his sixth trip as a GRS operator. His previous trips had taken him to the Middle East and elsewhere. For official purposes in Benghazi, Jack would simply say that he'd be working as a security staffer for U.S. government personnel. Men who protect spies don't advertise that fact. Before leaving the plane, Jack slipped off his gold wedding band and tucked it into a small box for safekeeping. He picked up the habit years earlier after deciding that he didn't want his enemies to know that he had a family, a wife, and two young sons for him back home in the Pacific Northwest. Jack stepped onto the tarmac and felt the bone-dry afternoon of the heat of the Libyan summer. His aviator glasses were modest protection from the harsh white glare of the North African sun. Entering the rundown terminal building, Jack pushed through the doors to a room with a luggage carousel and more than 100 people packed inside, a space that would have felt crowded with half as many. His fellow luggage seekers, most of them men, shouted in Arabic and gestured wildly as they fought to claim bags. The air was thick with flies and the nauseating stench of baked-on body odor. Jack took short breaths through his mouth in a futile effort to keep both at bay. He'd been on guard from the moment he left the plane, a reflex action whenever Jack arrived in hostile territory. Hyper-aware, his jaw set, his every movement grew deliberate, measured a convoy and measured to convey in body language that he wasn't looking for trouble, but wouldn't flinch from it either. Jack felt the stares of strangers upon him and knew that at least some were armed. He also knew that everyone watching him had reached the same instant conclusion: American. He suspected that at least some wished him dead. As he waited for his bags, Jack caught sight of a burly, bearded man standing with his back against the wall at the periphery of the scrum. The man's eyes scanned the crowd while his body remained still as a lizard on a tree limb. He wore khaki cargo pants and a navy blue button-down shirt, untucked. Jack knew to conceal a gun in his waistband. Their eyes met for an instant. Jack returned his gaze to the luggage carousel, and the bearded man remained expressionless, glued to the wall. When Jack grabbed his bags, the man pushed away from the wall and turned toward the exit door leading to customs. Jack followed a short distance behind, and by the time Jack stepped outside the terminal building, he and the bearded man had closed the distance between them and had fallen into step with each other. Still, they didn't speak as the man led Jack toward a white Toyota pickup truck caked in dust. Jack tossed his bags in the back and slid into the passenger seat. The bearded man got behind the wheel. In a single practiced motion, the man reached down and grabbed a pistol. "It's loaded," he said. He held it out, butt in first. Jack relaxed as he took the gun. He reached out his right hand and returned the powerful handshake offered by his fellow former SEAL and GRS colleague Tyrone Woods, whose radio call sign was Roan. "How's it going, brother?" Roan said, a bright smile emerging from his thick, salt and peppered beard. As Roan started the truck, they caught up on each other's lives and families. Then set aside those thoughts, like wedding rings slipped into boxes. Roan drove toward the airport exit, bound for an upscale neighborhood called Western Fouata. Their destination was a CIA-rented property known as the Annex, which was the agency's secret headquarters in Benghazi. Less than a mile from the Annex was the United States public presence in the city, a walled estate known as the U.S. Special Mission Compound, which served as a base for State Department diplomats. As their talk turned to business, Rome filled Jack in on about the peculiarities of the treacherous place where they'd be working to keep other Americans safe. Rome's overriding message was that they'd be kept busy and they'd have to remain alert. There was nothing about Benghazi they couldn't handle. In a strange way, Rome said, he almost liked the place. Still, something about his old friend described Benghazi, a lawless city where no one was in control, where lines between Americans' friends and enemies shifted and blurred, where they could trust only each other. That gave Jack the distinct impression that Rome considered this to be their diciest assignment yet. Jack had landed in a country most Americans only know from disturbing headlines. A North African nation roughly the size of Alaska, Libya is a vast desert with a tiny fringe of fertile soil on its northern coast. To its west are Tunisia and Algeria. To its east is Egypt. And to its south is Niger, Chad, and Sudan. The country is divided into three regions. Tripolitania to the west, with Tripoli as its capital. Sarencia to the east, with Benghazi as its capital. And Fazim to the arid south. A majority of the 6 million Libyans live in or around Tripoli and Benghazi. At the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, some 97% of the population is Sunni Muslim. A brief history of Libya is an inventory of invasions by outside powers. If an empire had ships and armies in the Mediterranean, its to conquer list included Libya's two major ports, Tripoli to the west and Benghazi to the east, separated by the Gulf of Sidra. Only the millennia occupiers included the Phoenicians, the Persians, the Romans, the Byzantines, and the Ottomans. Sometimes competing empires split the baby. The Greeks claimed the area around Benghazi in 630 BC, while the Romans settled near Tripoli. Historians say the Greeks even named Libya, using it as a term to describe all of northern Africa west of Egypt. By 74 BC, the Romans had conquered eastern Libya, temporarily uniting the east and the west. Then came the Vandals, a Germanic tribe that drove out the Romans and earned their namesake reputation by plundering the east. The Ottomans invaded Tripoli in 1551 and ruled Libya for more than 3 centuries, with limited success controlling the ever-resistant eastern tribes around Benghazi. While successive conquerors were vanquished in bleeding Libya, 2 Arab tribes flowed into its sands from Egypt. Starting in the 11th century, the Bani Hilal tribe settled near Tripoli, while the Beni Salim tribe settled in the east. The Bani Salim freely mixed with and married the native Berbers around Benghazi. As generations passed, the result was a homogeneous ethnic and religious region, with one historian called the total Arabization of eastern Libya. During the 1800s, the Ottoman Turks gave up hope of controlling Benghazi. The Turks allowed eastern Libya to exist as a semi-independent state, ruled by the Senussi Muslim sect, which preached a pure form of Islam, under which followers conducted all aspects of their lives by the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. While Tripoli and western Libya matured into a relatively modern region, eastern Libya retained its old ways, governed by tribal bonds and religious laws. The divide made it impossible to understand present-day Libya without contrasting Benghazi with its larger, richer, better-looking, and worldlier sister, Tripoli. In 1912, the exhausted Ottoman Empire signed a secret pact that gave Italy control of both West and East Libya. Tripoli adapted to Italian rule by Eastern Libya, but Eastern Libya fought colonialization. especially by a Christian nation. By 1920, the Italians had had enough. Drained by the First World War, Rome ceded autonomy over eastern Libya to Idris al Senussi, head of the strict Senussi religious order. When Benito Mussolini rose to power in Italy 2 years later, the fascist dictator wanted Benghazi to be part of his empire. Years of fierce fighting followed. In September 1931, Italian forces finally captured and hanged the leader of the opposition guerrillas, Omar al Mukhtar, a Senussi sheikh who became a martyr to Libyan independence. Even with Mukhtar gone, Mussolini set out to destroy any entrenched opposition around Benghazi. He built a 200-mile fence along the border of Egypt, and by some estimates, deported one-third of eastern Libya's civilian population to concentration camps. He executed 12,000 more. With Benghazi under Italian control, waves of workers arrived from across the Mediterranean. The Arab natives were forced into menial jobs, deprived of schooling, and excluded from politics. World War II made matters worse, as Benghazi was bombed hundreds of times by the Axis and Allied powers, as they traded control over the rubble. British pilots adapted a popular song to reflect the carnage, with a lyric that included the line, "We're off to bomb Benghazi." Like a long abused animal, Benghazi grew mean and wary. After World War II, Libya was divided among the British, French, and Americans. Oil had yet to be discovered, so no one wanted colonial responsibility for an impoverished, bombed out Arab sandbox. In 1951, the Allies helped to establish the United Kingdom of Libya, an independent constitutional monarchy ruled by the Muslim leader Idris al Sunusi. The title was better than the job. King Idris had dominion over the world's poorest country and one of its least illiterate. That changed radically in 1959 with the discovery of immense oil reserves, even to eventually account enough to eventually account for 2% of global supplies and more than 1 million barrels exported daily in 2012. Suddenly, King Idris had money to lavish on friends and pet projects in his native east, leaving Tripoli and Libya's west to decay. In east and west alike, the elite grew rich while everyone else remained poor. In 1969, while the 80-year-old King Idris was abroad, the timing was right for a bloodless coup led by a power-hungry 27-year-old army officer, Muammar al-Gaddafi. Over the next 42 years, the erratic, brutal, egomaniacal Gaddafi earned the sobriquet bestowed upon him by Ronald Reagan, the mad dog of the Middle East. From the start, Gaddafi worried about Benghazi's rebellious bent and its ties to the exiled King Idris. So he squeezed the region dry. Previously, the Libyan capital had alternated between Tripoli and Benghazi. Gaddafi made Tripoli the permanent capital. He moved the National Oil Corporation from Benghazi to Tripoli, despite the fact that most of the country's oil is in its east. He relocated a memorial that had been erected in Benghazi to honor Omar al-Mukhtar, fearing the Benghazians would rally behind the rebel martyr's legacy, as they eventually did. As hospitals, schools, and the standard of living rose in Tripoli, Benghazi suffered oppression and neglect, while its oil paid Tripoli's bills. Benghazians seized as they watched Gaddafi celebrate himself in countless statues and endless tributes. The bitter separation between Benghazi and Tripoli wasn't just political and cultural, but physical. No railway or highway connected the two cities, only narrow roads that snaked through more than 600 miles of desert. Through all the turmoil, one comfort from Benghazians was their local soccer club, Al Ahly Benghazi SC, whose name translates to the People's Club. Gaddafi favored rival Tripoli soccer clubs and despised Al Ahly Benghazi. The hatred deepened after the Benghazi team won the 1974 League Championship, a victory that coincided with the anniversary of Gaddafi's coup. Benghazi fans flooded the streets to celebrate their club's triumph, ignoring the milestone of Gaddafi's rule. He wouldn't forget nor forgive. Years later, Gaddafi's soccer-playing son, Saudi, became owner, manager, and captain of a soccer club called Al Ahly Tripoli. Saidi rated Al Ahly Benghazi for its best players and bribed or bullied referees to ensure victories. By the summer of 2000, Al Ahly Benghazi was on the verge of disgrace. One more loss and it would fall from the country's top soccer division. Saidi Gaddafi came to Benghazi to luxuriate in his rival's agony. As the referees made dubious calls, the crowd grew restless. When a loss seemed inevitable, something snapped. The humiliation of their cherished soccer club became a symbol of all that Benghazi had endured under Gaddafi. From public executions to relentless poverty amidst spectacular oil wealth, Al Ahly Benghazi's head coach shoved the referee. Fans stormed the field, then spilled onto the streets. They torched the National Soccer Federation building and hurled stones at monuments to Gaddafi's regime. The penalties were predictably severe. 80 were arrested, 30 sent to Tripoli to stand trial, and 3 sentenced to death. On September 1st, 2000, on the 31st anniversary of Gaddafi's coup, the security forces stormed the Al Ahly Benghazi clubhouse. They smashed furniture, memorabilia, and trophies, then bulldozed the building. The club was suspended indefinitely. Benghazi got its revenge a decade later, in 2011. After suffering countless more indignities and witnessing the Arab Spring revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia, the city became the cradle of the Libyan civil war that ended Gaddafi's rule and his life. Jack's arrival in Benghazi was the latest chapter in the adventurous life of a modern gunfighter. He grew up in Northern California, the only child of immigrants who worked long, hard hours to send him to private school. As a boy, Jack spent as much time as possible outside, building forts and imagining what it would take to survive if America's enemies invaded his hometown. He excelled at science and math, but after a single day of college, decided that he'd had enough of formal education. And Jack enlisted in the Navy with a single goal: to become a Navy SEAL. Jack was 19 and completed boot camp when he was sent to a 10-week Navy vocational training program. There, Jack badgered his instructors to arrange a screening test for admission to the Navy's Basic Underwater Demolition School, the first step in the year-long process to become a Navy SEAL. But when the opportunity arrived without notice, Jack had been enjoying himself so much in vocational classes during the day and partying at night that he'd let his physical training slip. The screening test was only a fraction of what it took to become a SEAL. It was tough enough to weed out candidates with no chance of making it. Jack's friends considered the chiseled young sailor a shoo-in. He made it through the 500-yard swim in the required time. Jack climbed out of the pool and far exceeded the required number of push-ups, completing more than 80 in 2 minutes. Next were sit-ups, and he exceeded the standard there too. Then came pull-ups. The screening test required applicants to do 8 perfect dead hang pull-ups with virtually no rest between exercises. After weeks of slacking, Jack did 6, then willed himself to a 7th. His muscles screamed, his lungs ached, and his arms were on fire. Jack made it halfway up on the 8th, but couldn't get his chin above the bar. Jack hung there, refusing to let go, but lacking the strength to pull himself higher. The veteran Master Chief SEAL, giving Jack the test, prodded him. If I light a fire under your ass, you can get over that. Can you get over that bar? Jack tried again, but couldn't. When he dropped to the ground, his eyes filled with tears, Jack returned to his room and told his shocked friends that he failed. He'd remember it as one of the most traumatizing and motivating moments of his life. Instead of going through the legendary SEAL training program and becoming an elite special operator, Jack spent the next 2 years as a Navy airman on an aircraft carrier. When his next chance came, Jack destroyed every category of the Navy SEAL screening test. By the time he finished SEAL training, Jack came to appreciate the yin and yang of what he'd experienced the previous 2 years. The humbling failure and its consequences gave him the strength and willpower to push through the brutal selection process and earn his trident, the prize SEAL Signia. While scores of others would-be warriors quit, Jack didn't talk much about his exploits, but during a decade in the service, he spent time in more than 20 countries and carried out missions in Kosovo, the Middle East, and the Middle East. He left the SEALs to spend more time with his growing family and to try his hand at business. Jack bought and sold real estate, renovating and flipping properties while working to stay one step ahead of the tumultuous market. By the time Jack and Roan joined forces as GRS operators in Benghazi, the two former Navy SEALs had been friends for nearly a decade. They'd met when both served as instructors at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility in Niland, California. One night, not long after they met, Jack spent a night drinking at a local bar and didn't want to drive home. He walked to Roan's nearby condo, planning to crash there until morning. Not knowing who was at his door, Roan climbed out a window wearing only boxer shorts and carrying a pistol. He moved tactically around the corner of the front of the building, gun raised to outflank the presumed intruder. When he saw it was a drunken Jack, Roan lowered his gun and laughed. When Roan wasn't pointing a gun at him, Jack considered Roan to be a smart and effective and a natural leader, and perhaps the most motivated and hardest working person he'd ever met. No small praise among special operations veterans. Roan was 41, a twice married father of 3 sons. A former high school wrestler, he liked fast motorcycles and muscle cars, especially Ford Cobra Mustangs. Roan had a weightlifter's broad chest, light brown hair, a meaty chin, and forearms like pile drivers. He'd earned his SEAL training in 1991 after twice going through Hell Week, and a 5.5-day torture test of mental and physical toughness, pain and cold tolerance, teamwork and determination, all on fewer than 4 hours of sleep. As a SEAL, Roan had served bravely in Somalia, Afghanistan, and Iraq, where he had received a Bronze Star with a V for valor. The citation described his heroic achievement, extraordinary guidance, zealous initiative, and total dedication to duty. In Al Anbar province of western Iraq, he was a healer as well as a warrior. Having become a registered nurse and paramedic, Roan retired from the SEALs in 2010 with 20 years of service. He bought a bar called the Salty Frog in Imperial Beach, California, and helped his wife in her dental practice. While Roan and Jack were adapting to civilian life, U.S. government agencies began increasing their reliance on special operations veterans willing to provide security to Americans in the world's hottest spots. Jack and Roan each heard through the SEAL grapevine about openings at GRS for accomplished former operators. Both saw a chance to return to the camaraderie and the purpose they'd loved as SEALs. And then there was the money. Each trip by a GRS contractor generally lasted several months, and even with generous downtime between trips, Contract operators typically earn more than $150,000 a year. If challenge and money were the yin, danger was the yang. They worked undercover in small teams, in places where some locals saw the very presence of armed Americans as provocation. In December 2009, three GRS operators were among the 7 Americans killed in Khost, Afghanistan, where a Jordanian triple agent working for Al Qaeda detonated a suicide bomb at a CIA compound. Jack, Roan, and scores of other former special operators balanced the risks and rewards, then chose to join GRS. Among them was another of Jack's close friends in the SEALs, a high-spirited, fun-loving operator named Glenn Bub Doherty. Jack and Glenn had become SEALs the same year, and now Glenn also was a contractor for the GRS in Libya, working in Tripoli. Not surprisingly, in the tight-knit world of former SEALs, Glenn and Roan had also become friends. More than 15 years after Jack became a SEAL, he remembered a warning from one of their instructors. Look around the room. In 20 years, half of you guys will be gone. Guys sitting next to you are going to be killed in training accidents or in combat or whatever. The longer he remained an operator for hire, Jack knew, the more likely that prediction would come true. Maybe for himself, maybe for Glenn or Roan, or maybe for them all. At the dawn of the Libyan Revolution, Benghazians expressed thanks to the Americans in their midst for the United States' help in the fight against Gaddafi. In May of 2011, the New York Times published a story that described how cab drivers, translators, and cafes refused payment from Americans. Benghazi youths waved the American flag alongside rebel banners. Some parents of newborn girls reportedly named their children Susan in honor of Susan Rice, the Obama administration's ambassador to the United Nations, for her support of a no-fly zone that grounded Gaddafi's warplanes. Americans, and for that matter, all Westerners, are treated hereabouts with a warmth and gratitude rarely seen in any Muslim country. In probably half a century or more of the Times story gushed, people smile and go out of their way to say hello to them and are almost shockingly courteous. But the cheerful story ended on a discordant note. The last paragraph described a bullet whizzing over the head of a foreign jogger, presumably the reporter. The sound of the rifle's report came a second later, as it would with a high-velocity round. Whoever fired it was not about to show himself, or at least not yet. It foreshadowed what lay ahead. Little more than a year later, the Benghazi through which Roan and Jack drove in the pickup wasn't waving American flags or offering them free meals. After Gaddafi was dragged from a drainage ditch, sodomized and killed by rebel fighters in October 2011, heavily armed militias had toppled the regime, sought to expand their roles in a post-revolutionary Libya. With the approval of Libya's weak transitional government and the absence of a strong military or police force, local militias shifted from revolutionary fighters to National Guardsmen, ostensibly to prevent Benghazi from spiraling into chaos. Some militias remained outwardly grateful to America. Members of one militia, the large and well-armed 17th February Martyrs Brigade, were hired to provide security and act as a Libyan quick reaction force to protect the U.S. State Department's Special Mission Compound in Benghazi. Financed by the Libyan Defense Ministry, the 17th February militia had established bases and training facilities, assembled an arsenal of light and heavy weapons, and enrolled as many as 3,500 members, organized into battalions. The United States' relationship with and reliance on the 17th February militia was a classic example of how the quirks of Benghazi led to strange bedfellows. The militia took its name from an incident in February 17, 2006, during which Libyan security forces killed roughly a dozen people during a violent protest at the Italian consulate in Benghazi. The protesters who set fire to the consulate building and several cars were enraged by an Italian government minister who wore a t-shirt displaying controversial cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. The militia's name also referenced February 17, 2011, the start of the revolution to overthrow Gaddafi. Questions lingered about how much the United States diplomatic corps could trust the 17 February militia, at least some of those whose members were suspected of fierce anti-American sentiments. No such questions existed when it came to several other Benghazi militias, which were outright enemies of the United States. The city harbored at least two hardline Islamic militias, aligned ideologically with Al Qaeda, that openly despised America and the West. One virulent anti American militia was called Ansar al Sharia Brigade, whose name meant partisans of Islamic law, and whose members believed that democracy is un-Islamic, and that all authority is derived from the Prophet Muhammad. Some members of Benghazi's radical Islamist militias had fought against American troops in Iraq after the U.S. invasion in 2003. Not only were these jihadis turned militiamen highly motivated to kill Americans, they had also meant to do so. After Gaddafi fell, Benghazi was awash in weapons left over from the revolution. Personal ownership of firearms had been outlawed since Libya gained independence, but when Gaddafi's soldiers were driven from the city, rebel fighters raided the armories where the regime had stockpiled thousands of AK-47s and more powerful weapons. After the revolution, anyone who didn't already have a gun could simply shop for one at a large outdoor called Al Fundwa. Beyond flea market fare, past food stalls with eggs, spices, and poultry, arms merchants threw open their car trunks to display pistols, assault rifles, grenades, mortars, rocket launchers, and heavy machine guns, ready to be mounted on pickup trucks. The result of the free flow of guns could be seen on the bloody-soaked gurneys of Benghazi's only hospital, equipped for major surgery. 1,761 gunshot wounds in 2011, up from an average of 41 in the previous 2 years. The abundance of weapons, the absence of a working Libyan government, and lingering anti-Western sentiments amongst certain militias led to increasingly brazen incidents during the spring and summer of 2012. On April 2nd, a British armored diplomatic vehicle was attacked after driving into local protests. On April 6th, a homemade bomb was thrown over the wall of the U.S. Special Mission compound. 4 days later, another homemade bomb was lobbed at the motorcade of Ian Martin, a UN Special Envoy in Libya. In May, a rocket-propelled grenade struck the Benghazi offices of the International Committee of the Red Cross. A previously unknown organization, the Omar Abdul Rahman Group, claimed responsibility and issued a threat against the United States on social media sites. The attack escalated on June 6 when an improvised explosive device blew a hole in the wall around the U.S. diplomatic compound. No one was injured, but the vulnerability of the compound property was evident. A pro-Al-Qaeda group took credit, calling it retaliation for the death of Al-Qaeda commander Abu Yahid al-Libi, a native of eastern Libya, killed in a drone strike in Pakistan. 5 days later, in June 11, 2012, attackers fired a rocket-propelled grenade at a car carrying Senior Dominic Esquith, a British ambassador to Libya, as it drove through Benghazi. Esquith was unhurt, but 2 members of his security team were injured. The attack took place a half mile from the U.S. diplomatic compound. American operators responded and brought their injured British cohorts to the hospital. The next day, the UK closed its Benghazi consulate and evacuated its staffers. The U.S. government review of events in Benghazi during the spring of summer 2012 found a general backdrop of political violence, assassinations targeting former regime officials, lawlessness, and an overarching absence of central government authority in eastern Libya. On June 25th, America's ambassador to Libya, J. Christopher Stevens, sent a cable to Washington, quoting local sources who said Islamic extremism appeared to be rising in eastern Libya, and that Al Qaeda's black and white flag had been spotted several times over government buildings and training facilities. On August 2nd, even as Jack was en route to join the GRS team in Benghazi, Stevens sent another cable to Washington seeking more bodyguards. The ambassador warned that the security condition in Libya is unpredictable, volatile, and violent. 2 years before meeting at the Benghazi airport, Jack and Ron unexpectedly ran into each other in the lobby of an East Coast hotel. Both had signed up to undergo screening and training to become GRS operators. By coincidence, their friend and fellow former SEAL Glenn Bob Doherty was there too. Several times since entering the GRS, Roan and Jack had been assigned to the same hazardous places. Roan usually landed first, then cryptically told Jack via email what to bring and what to expect. That was the case in Benghazi, where Roan had arrived a month earlier on his second trip to the city. Jack felt like a new kid in school with a savvy older buddy waiting to show him around. But that would soon change. Roan told Jack that the summer in Benghazi would be his last job for the GRS. His contract was set to expire in early September, and he wanted to spend more time with his wife and to help raise their infant son. As Roan drove from the airport and Jack scanned their surroundings, they steeled themselves for what lay ahead. The airport was outside the city, 13 miles east of downtown Benghazi. Roan plotted an indirect course with twists and turns to make sure they weren't being followed. Before flying to Benghazi, Jack had used Google Earth and maps to learn the basic layout. His map study showed a city roughly the size of Atlanta, designed like one half of a target, with the port as its bullseye. Radiating outward from the port were 5 curved, half-moon-shaped ring roads, named First Ring through Fifth Ring. Straight roads that moved traffic closer or further from the port intersected the roads. From the air, Benghazi looked like a spider's web. Minutes into the drive, Ron and Jack came upon a checkpoint, little more than a bullet-pocked cement building that straddled the road's median. Ron slowed to a stop as 2 young men approached the pickup carrying AK-47s and dressed in a mix of military uniforms and civilian clothes. Off to one side, another young Libyan man stood in the bed of an improvised military vehicle known as a technical, a pickup truck with a mounted heavy machine gun in the back. Roan had good reason to be cautious. Several weeks earlier, he and another GRS operator were driven from the airport with a truckload of supplies when members of a radical Islamist militia stopped them at gunpoint. Roan and the other operator believed that their antagonists were from the extremist Ansar al-Sharia brigade. The heavily armed militia told Roan that the supplies now belonged to them. Roan and the other operator raised their assault rifles and declined the offer to be robbed. Roan radioed for backup from his fellow GRS operators still at the annex. But as the CIA's top officer in Benghazi, a man known publicly only as Bob, instead promised that he'd alert the 17th February Martyrs Brigade and have the ostensibly friendly militia serve as a quick reaction force. Hearing Roan's call for help, other GRS operators at the annex gear and rushed to the armored car. But Bob, the base chief, ordered them to stay put. After 15 tense minutes, during which several GRS operators argued with Bob, Roan radioed that he talked his way out of the standoff without firing a shot. Had it escalated, the outnumbered and outgunned Americans would have stood little chance. No friendly 17th February militiamen ever arrived to help. Weeks later, the GRS operators, still fuming, festering tensions with the CIA's Benghazi chief, became an ongoing issue. Some of the more vocal operators wrote Bob off as spineless, or as one put it, a chicken shit careerist, focused on retirement and a cushy government pension. Another possibility was that Bob's primary concern was not blowing the CIA's cover, even if it meant leaving the operators to fend for themselves. When Roan and Jack were stopped on the drive from the airport, Roan knew that they'd encountered a relatively benign, quasi official checkpoint. Roan calmly held up a document that identified him as a U.S. government employee. The young man scanned it and waved him on. Roan and Jack about the gunpoint confrontation the previous month. Roan told Jack about the gunpoint confrontation the previous month, warning him about makeshift roadblocks that militia groups threw up unexpectedly. Some GRS operators called the rogue militias gangs with guns, filled with twitchy young men amped from chewing leaves of cotton. If Roan and Jack had crossed paths with those militiamen, they'd likely need to fight, flee, or both. Driving west along barren stretches of the highway that Roan called Airport Road, Jack saw undernourished horses scavenging for garbage, scraggly sheep, and walls marked with Arabic graffiti. As they approached more densely populated areas, the landscape shifted to ramshackle strip malls with internet cafes, hookah shops, and fabric stores, flanked by roadside stands where vendors hawk tomatoes and melons. No rain falls in Benghazi from June through August. No, so desert dust covered everything from the cars to the stores to the people in the streets. Most of the men Jack and Rome passed wore Western clothing. Some, though some dressed in loose-fitting cotton clothes the operators called man jammies. Women were scarce in the streets, and the few Jack spotted wore black abayas and hijabs, the traditional Muslim cloaks and veils. Children and feral cats roamed up unpaved alleys off the main streets, and Jack saw five boys. Saw I'm sorry. Saw Jack saw boys 5 to 7 years old playing with a discarded tire. Jack and Roan talked to bringing their sons to a third world country to show them how fortunate they were. As Roan continued to circuitous drive, Jack noticed Benghazi's most common architectural style, the unfinished, scaffold-wrapped concrete building. He smelled diesel fuel, roasting meat, rotting fruit, and cutting through it all, urine and feces. The city of more than 700,000 residents had one badly outmatched sewage treatment plant. Waste flowed into the streets and ground, and the 23 Lake July Lake, a lagoon between downtown and the port, where families picnicked. As Jack's tour continued, he learned that the city's infrastructure was broken or non existent. Electricity went off and on at random. Dry fields featured bumper crops of plastic bags. If motor vehicle laws existed, no one seemed to know or care. Every other car seemed to have broken brake lights. Traffic routinely choked up at even minor intersections. Technicals were more common than police cars. Jack saw a burning car on the side of the street, but not a person in sight, only a pack of wild dogs foraging for food. Yet beyond the filth and chaos were touches of natural beauty. From green mountains beyond the city limits to soaring palm trees at the edges of white sand beaches to sparkling blue Mediterranean. If the breeze was right, fresh salt air cut through the city's stink. Grapevines and guava trees graced stately old homes. Impressive ruins from past civilizations dotted the region. Dreamers who squinted and held their noses imagined that Benghazi had the raw makings of a beach resort. Roan drove along the Fifth Ring Road to the outer reaches of the city to avoid temporary barricades and checkpoints. He cut across the Fourth Ring Road, then wended his way to the western Fayat neighborhood, the area where Benghazi's best address, home to decent restaurants and pricey stores, where the remaining foreign envoys clustered in estates surrounded by walls of cinder block, mud, and stone, topped with razor wire and broken glass. Although the neighborhood was better than most, it was still Benghazi. As they approached the CIA annex, Rome taught Jack the names of the GRS operators used for the local streets. Like Racetrack, Gunfighter, and Adidas. Not far from their destination, Roan radioed the front gate so he and Jack wouldn't be vulnerable while waiting for someone to let them in. Soon Jack would meet the other contract operators at the annex, men he'd come to know as Tonto, Tig, DB, and Oz, along with a CIA staffer who was the GRS team leader. In his radio call, Roan reported that he had minimal control of the pickup, meaning that he had left the vehicle for a period of time while at the airport. An agency staffer who oversaw annex security would need to inspect under the hood, around the wheels, and elsewhere, in case someone who hated America might have planted a bomb. Roan and Jack pulled up to a steel gate in a 10-foot high concrete brick wall. Security cameras looked down on them, although it was supposed to be a secret location, or at least a discreet one. Jack immediately realized that they weren't fooling anyone. Even a casual observer would have noticed the tight security, not to mention the carloads of Americans driving in and out day and night. The gate to the CIA Benghazi annex compound swung open. A guard raised a steel traffic arm and waved Roan and Jack inside. Everybody, that takes everything up through chapter 1. Next week, we can start on chapter 2. Anybody who wants to discuss some questions, if you haven't already, we go ahead and text some in, and we're going to go over a few of them. Okay. We have the first one from Dan Alley. And Dan, thanks for joining us tonight. Mark, I had heard that the picture of Ambassador Stevens that appears he was being beaten was a fake picture. Have you seen the picture, and can you address this? You know, there were several videos that were taken by locals who were in and around the special mission compound or the consulate when the ambassador was drug out of the main structure where he was at. And then there was another picture that had shown a person who looked like he was mutilated and his clothes torn off. And around that surrounded a lot of controversy about whether he was dragged through the streets, beaten and sodomized. I can tell you that he wasn't. What had happened was, and for everybody out there, Ambassador Stevens was one of the few people that the majority of the civilians in Benghazi loved. He's the one who helped overthrow Gaddafi, was able to put together the coalition, the militias, under Feb 17, and was instrumental in that. What happened that night was after he had been killed inside, and he died from smoke inhalation, not from any gunfire or explosions. As he was pulled out, a neighbor who knew him had came over to see what was going on and saw them pulling him out and grabbed him up, threw him in his car, and took him to the local hospital, which was later where we were able to retrieve him through a asset that we had hired to go there and retrieve his body for us. I hope that clarifies and answers your question. Next, we have the hair guards. Mark, how are you handling not being able to travel? Well, you know, that's one reason why I decided to do this here is one, I wanted to share the story of Benghazi. You know, most of my career since Benghazi has been done doing a lot of speaking events around the country. And this was just another way of me being able to share the story to all of those Americans out there that have always supported us, or those that maybe not have known about what Benghazi was about, but really want to hear the story. So thank you for all of you who have checked in, who are watching now, and who are also maybe following on Facebook or YouTube. Next is Crystal. I know you lived through this, but how does it affect you to read this and go back to that time? Well, Crystal, this is, you know, it's difficult at times. You know, there's only one time, and it was this year that I watched the whole movie since the premiere. and I was able to do that up in New Hampshire with some friends called Swim with the Mission. Phil Taub is a great American who started that organization that helps a lot of other veteran organizations. And he held a private screening to raise money for Shadow Warriors through his organization to help support us as well, and invited me up to participate in that. And that, as well as reading through this book, it does take me back a little bit. But what I focus on is what happened and why everything did happen that night. And most of that was to honor, and most of this is to honor Ty and Glenn, who died next to me. So I just want to thank them for their sacrifice, and we got to never forget them. Never forget those who have gone before. Mark Stroller. Mark Stroller, how fluid was the environment in Benghazi? Did you know all of the usual actors, or was there an influx of extremists? Well, when I had arrived in Benghazi, I'd only been there about 45 days. I got there not long after, or right around the end of July. So first part of August, and right around the same time as Jack did. And what we knew of was Benghazi was a town that was controlled by militias. I mean, 10 to 15 different militias that had originally came together under February 17th Martyr Brigade banner to overthrow Gaddafi. But like most things, when they had that common threat or that common hatred, they passed that up. After that was gone, they found something else to hate, and they couldn't stay together, and for the greater good of the people of Benghazi and for their country. Next, we have Lindsay. Lindsay, what made you decide to start your nonprofit Shadow Warriors Project, and what does your organization do? Great question, Lindsay. Thank you so much for that. What got me to start that is Shadow Warriors Project. Our primary goal is to help the families and contractors, and the families of those contractors who get killed or injured while serving abroad. Right now we have 2.4 contractors for every sailor, soldier, airman, or Marine serving in Afghanistan or Iraq. Since 2001, there have been over 5,000 contractors killed in the war on terror. Contractors have a workman's comp policy. We get a great salary, but we also are put out there to great risks. We don't have the backup of the United States military, especially as in Benghazi, when in those type of countries. And there's a lot of these families that we don't get VA benefits if our injuries occur from being a contractor. So we wanted to make sure that the families of those that are continuing to serve our country abroad, or get killed while serving or injured severely while serving, are able to still live the life that they should and have the support as all other patriots who are fighting for this country. I hope that answers your question. If you have further ones, you can reach us on our website, shadowwarriorsproject.org. Joe asks, Oz, left off my question, who's better, a Marine or a SEAL? Okay, he started out with, hey there, Oz, brother Joe here. Great job, and great to see you doing these during these trying times. Faith, not fear. Love your brother. And it's a prime example. I mean, they had 3 Marines in Benghazi. They had 2 Navy SEALs and Army Rangers. So they knew who they needed the most and the best. So you had to stack it heavy with Marines. Hope that answers your question, Joe. And I think you already knew the answer to that one anyways. Joe is a fellow Marine and great patriot, and he is a great warrior who served this country greatly. Dave Keller. Dave asks, what is it like serving in a country as a private contractor versus as a U.S. Marine? Semper Fi. Well, one of the big differences, especially when we're in a majority of the countries that we serve in, outside of Iraq and Afghanistan, especially back during the beginnings and when we were military in Iraq and Afghanistan, you always had that extra support. Where when in a lot of those other countries, as we said, TIG served in Pakistan. I served in a lot of different countries. Well, you're there pretty much on your own. I mean, you have very little support, very little backup, and we go in there understanding that, and we knew that all going into Benghazi. The problem I really had with Benghazi and how the outcome and the lack of support we got from the administration at the time was that we had a U.S. ambassador who was missing and or kidnapped or dead, and we're in the Mediterranean. I mean, we're off the coast. We're not too far from Crete. We're not too far from Italy. There's plenty of military assets, and and a U.S. ambassador is the direct representative of the President of the United States. And I think a good example is, and I don't want to get into the politics, but a good example is how an administration should react to that is what we saw from President Trump when the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad came under protest. Um, you know, you saw immediately what was going on, U.S. troops moving that way. One other one we have here, another one from John and Tiffany. How well do you feel the movie did the incident? John and Tiffany, thank you very much for that question. Um, I think each one of us, whether it's Tig, myself, Tonto, DB, Jack, we all have a little how it was portrayed, but I think we're under the same opinion that it kept. Well, they tried to take 400 pages and condense it into a 2 hour and 15-minute movie. Liberties within that, but I will say that I can speak for that is that I think they kept to the spirit of the book, though there were some changes. They weren't context, and that the movie itself showed what it was like and what we went through, and how the events transpired throughout that evening. Next, we have Gabriella Mara. How frequently will these happen? I don't want to miss any. Okay, if you're talking Gabriella, we're talking every Wednesday night until we finish the book at 8 p.m. Eastern time, 6 o'clock Mountain time. We're going to do this to finish the book. Depending on how long the chapters go, we're going to either do 1 or 2 chapters every Wednesday night. So please let your friends know. Join us. I'm glad you came on, and great question. Thanks for being a part of this. Next, we have Bob Dickinson. Bob Dickinson, how long were you there on site before this? Bob, I was there for about 45 days. I got there around the 30th or 31st of July. Is when I flew in myself. Next, we have Nelson Broadfoot. Nelson says, hey, Oz, based on the appeared to have some respect for the station chief during Jack's intro into the team. What was that the case, and how do you feel about him now? Thanks. Nelson, if I sit back and I look at Bob's position and his situation, I can't, I got to have envy for him to some degree and respect for how his decision-making process, he had a lot broader look of things, and what his issue wasn't going to be easy. It's not an easy decision for him. As well, it wasn't an easy decision for us to go against what he said, to go over there. But, because we were the security team for there, it just for us, they just said, you know what? There's American lives, and we can make a difference in their life. We're going to do everything we can. Just another one. Paul. Oz, do you think Max Martini did a good job portraying you? I do. I think, you couldn't have asked for a better actor for me and my personality. I mean, one, we looked a whole lot alike. Um, Everyone on set called him my doppelganger, but he really got to know me both as a person and as I was growing up, my personality, as well as who I was there in Benghazi. And I am very proud to have him having um, represented me in that movie. And I got to give a shout out to all the actors out there and to Michael Bay for picking those that he did, because they really put their heart and soul into this movie to make sure that they portrayed us as we were and our personalities that went along with that. I think he should quickly address. Oh, okay. So I've got a few people have said we had some audio issues on here. We're using a top of the line audio mic. I think a lot of it is with everyone staying home, a lot of the audio issues, and we had a little bit of this when we did the initial test, was right now at this time of night. I think, there's a lot of people out there that are on, and some of those things are, it's taking up bandwidth. So I'm on my home internet doing this. So thank you for your consideration. Thank you for your patience in doing that. John and Tiffany again asked, where did the call sign Oz come from? Um, Kind of a little, I'll try to shorten up the story. Well, when I first started contracting in 2004, when I got over there, the group, I was, again, one of the older guys. I hadn't been working overseas for a while. I'd been in law enforcement. They had asked me what my call sign was. And, when I was in the Marine Corps back in the 80s and the 90s, we didn't have any, had a unit call sign, whether that be your platoon, your company, whatever it be. Um, they're I'm like, what do you mean call sign? They're like, well, what do we call you? I'm like, Mark. And they're like, well, you need a call sign. And I'm like, well, you can call me anything you want. Just don't call me late for payday, right? Well, about 4 days later, they finally came up with a call sign, and they called me Polter for Poltergeist. Well, I changed jobs and went to another contract. And when I got there was somebody named Potter. So Potter and Polter over the radio was too much alike. Um, they started calling me Wizard of Oz. And then when I went to another contract, somebody there was named Wizard. So eventually it just got dropped down to Oz. Um, Next we have, again, okay, we have John Zdaski. I probably bastardized your name, so I apologize for that up front. But John asked how accurate you feel the movie was in depicting the firefight. John, it was they. I thought they did a phenomenal job. I don't think you could have put it any better. And they kept in all those things that needed to be there. They didn't really extrapolate on it past what really happened. So I myself, and I know along with the other guys, we were really happy with how they depicted that. Next, we have Karen Ball. Karen asks, do you speak at nonprofit meetings? I do. Um, but also in that, anybody out there, I do make my living, or I did before the coronavirus and the quarantine. I make my living doing public speaking for the most part. So there is an honorarium that I do ask for. Please reach out to my website. There's a form on there if you're interested in hiring me um, and bringing me over. We can always work things out. And most likely, yeah, the first person you'll talk to is my assistant. Lee does a great job, and she can run anything that we need to possibly make that work out. So thank you. Julie Malone asks, what company do you feel to work for as a contractor? Um, you know, there's a lot of great companies, and they keep changing. When I was in Benghazi, I didn't work for a company. I was what they call a direct hire, which means I was hired directly by the U.S. government to work for them. Prior to that, I had worked for Triple Canopy, which was a great company. Um, I also worked for USIS, which was also a very great company, and I worked for a few others that um, I'll just have to say I can't really talk about right now, but they were all great companies. And but my advice to you, if you want to go into the contracting business, is make sure you do your you got to vet them as much as they're vetting you. Make sure you do your homework, and make sure that you got a solid company behind us. Thank you very much. Um, Next we have for Z, Joe. Joe kept lowering security level at the temporary embassy with the 9/11 anniversary looming and the ambassador on site, and seemingly no exit plan. Well, Joe, great question. So their exit plan, as far as I knew of it, was that they were, if they came under attack and they could get out, they were gonna. Not the greatest plan in my mind, but that's what their plan was. Why they kept lowering security, we've got a solid answer on. They've kind of left out a lot of that. No one really informed us of that. I think, my personally, my gut instinct is that the administration at the time was more worried about the. I am curious. Have a favorite Marine Corps unit that you served with? Um, I tell you, every Marine Corps unit I served with, uh, I say this is kind of maybe a cheesy answer, but my favorite Marine Corps unit was the United States Marine Corps. Couldn't ask for a better set of young men and women who are hard chargers. Spent 12 years there. I love them to death. I love everybody who has served, who is serving, or who is going to serve and makes it through that. Y'all put your feet on those yellow footprints and raise your hand to do the same thing. And I'm proud to call you all fellow Marines, brothers and sisters. So God bless you all out there. Thank you very much. Um, Next, I also have Roland Lettner. Um, Asks, what's my EDC? You got me on that acronym there, Roland. If you text back in what you're thinking of there, I'm not sure what you're meaning there, but thanks a lot for that. I'm going to move on to Janet Healy. Hold on here. Okay. Well, I don't know if you're hearing me or not, but it looks like the live event ended. Thank you all. God bless you for coming here. Thank you. And see you next Wednesday. Invite some more friends. God bless y'all. See you next week. Bye.